Ebony Harris was a determined individual who took great pride in her home at Redwood Lake Estates, a peaceful suburban enclave known for its manicured lawns and winding cul-de-sacs. As a black woman who had worked tirelessly to achieve her dream of owning property in this reputed neighborhood, Ebony reveled in the sense of accomplishment each time she stepped out her front door. Nevertheless, despite the neat rows of houses and the friendly faces she occasionally encountered, Ebony often felt a subtle wave of curiosity from residents who weren't used to seeing a woman of color settling comfortably in their midst. Behind her single-story house, she had invested in a modest but elegant in-ground pool. It wasn't the largest or the most luxurious pool one could imagine, yet it was hers, every inch paid for through long hours of labor, careful budgeting, and unwavering dedication. This pool served as her personal refuge, a cool oasis where she could temporarily disconnect from the stresses of her managerial job at a local tech firm. After a day spent juggling deadlines and guiding her team, Ebony yearned for those quiet moments by the water, where the steady ripple of reflections reminded her of the peace she had fought so hard to obtain. In the early mornings, she would often slip outside to watch the sunrise over the towering pines at the edge of Redwood Lake Estates. With a warm mug of coffee in hand, she'd let the gentle breeze brush across her face and whisper through the branches. It was these moments, still and serene, that reaffirmed she had made the right choice in purchasing her home. She relished the freedom of deciding when to host summer barbecues around her pool or simply lounge in a floating chair as the setting sun painted the clouds in soft pinks and oranges. Yet, Ebony was not entirely naive to the undertones that existed in her new environment. Redwood Lake Estates boasted a diverse population on paper, but in practice, minority residents remained a small fraction of the total homeowners. Over time, Ebony had caught passing glances from certain neighbors, polite but vaguely disapproving. She couldn't shake the feeling that some people saw her presence as incongruent with the long-standing image of a traditional suburban community. Still, she did her best to maintain a welcoming demeanor and positive outlook, believing that most residents were simply curious or somewhat unfamiliar with anyone breaking the neighborhood's long-held norms. Besides her pool, Ebony found solace in the cozy corners of her home. Whether in the living room with a thick novel in her lap or in the kitchen testing out her grandmother's old recipes, she felt surrounded by the sense of stability she had always yearned for. Every step on her property reminded her of her journey, the sacrifices, the triumphs, and the unyielding ambition that had brought her this far. For Ebony Harris, Redwood Lake Estates was more than a suburban retreat, it was a symbol of perseverance. She felt certain that her little slice of peace, especially her treasured in-ground pool, would shield her from the world's clamor. Little did she know that a single afternoon would upend this tranquility, testing her resilience in ways she never expected. Late one summer afternoon, after finishing her daily swim, Ebony Harris began her routine of cleaning and covering her in-ground pool in her backyard at Redwood Lake Estates. The air was warm, the sun still high in the sky, and the faint hum of lawnmowers could be heard in the distance as neighbors tidied their yards. Normally, she looked forward to this post-swim ritual. There was something gratifying about protecting and maintaining the space she had invested so much time and money in. However, on this particular day, her peaceful routine was abruptly interrupted. What do you think? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments, like, share, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. As she knelt by the edge of the pool to secure the last clip of the cover, a voice called out from behind the wooden fence. Moments later, Charlotte Davenport, the newly appointed president of the Redwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association, pushed open the gate leading into Ebony's backyard. Ebony had seen Charlotte before at a community gathering, though they had never exchanged more than polite greetings. Even so, the sudden, uninvited entry caught Ebony off guard. "Good afternoon," Charlotte said tersely, stepping onto the meticulously cut grass. She was a tall, imposing figure with sharply tailored slacks and a clipboard tucked under one arm. "Is there a reason you're covering the pool so early in the day?" Her question had a pointed edge that made Ebony feel uneasy. Ebony rose to her feet, brushing droplets of water off her shoulders. "Hi, Charlotte. I always cover the pool after I'm done swimming. It helps keep out debris and saves energy, too." Charlotte glanced around the yard, letting her eyes linger on the privacy fence, the small garden Ebony had planted, and finally the covered pool. With a faint, disapproving frown, she said, "The rest of the neighborhood enjoys a certain, open aesthetic. It maintains the community's atmosphere when pools are uncovered and uniform, especially during prime hours." Surprised by the implication that she should be guided by some unwritten rule, Ebony struggled to keep her tone polite. "Well, as far as I know, the HOA guidelines don't dictate how long a pool cover can stay on. Besides, I'm done for the day. I'd rather not leave the water exposed when I won't be using it." Charlotte pursed her lips, tapping her clipboard. "You're correct that there isn't an explicit rule. However, as the HOA president, I encourage homeowners to consider how their personal choices affect the entire community's image." Ebony felt a twinge of irritation. "I understand community standards, but I also have a right to manage my own pool. My property meets all the HOA's official guidelines." Their exchange was polite but tense. Charlotte's posture and tone suggested an unspoken disagreement, as though Ebony was violating an unwritten standard simply by prioritizing her own preferences. Despite the hostility implied, Ebony remained calm, focusing on the fact that she had done nothing wrong. When Charlotte finally departed, only after glaring once more at the covered pool, Ebony exhaled a slow breath. This was the first direct indication that her quiet routines might be viewed with suspicion or disapproval by her neighbors. She told herself not to overthink it, perhaps Charlotte was simply overzealous in her role. Yet, as she fastened the last edge of the pool cover, Ebony couldn't shake the feeling that this small confrontation hinted at something deeper. It was a reminder that even in a community as pristine as Redwood Lake Estates, not everyone embraced change, or those they perceived as outsiders. Ebony Harris, unsettled by the unexpected encounter with Charlotte Davenport, tried to brush off the uneasy feeling gnawing at her. She retreated indoors, thinking a glass of iced tea and a favorite novel might help her relax. Still, her mind churned over Charlotte's insistence that leaving the pool uncovered was somehow better for the neighborhood's atmosphere. The implication that her personal choices needed to fit a certain mold lingered, stirring questions of whether underlying biases fueled Charlotte's complaint. As Ebony settled into her living room, the sunlight filtering through gauzy curtains, she revisited her brief history in Redwood Lake Estates. She had moved in hoping to find a serene environment, somewhere she could be herself without constant scrutiny. At first, the neighbors seemed friendly in passing. A smile or a nod when walking dogs, a short conversation near the communal mailbox. Nothing had been overtly hostile, and Ebony was used to subtle glances that came with being one of the few black homeowners in the area. Yet, over time, there had been small moments that hinted at something more complex. A neighbor who seemed surprised she could afford a home there. Another resident who made an offhand remark about Ebony's interesting background, as though her success needed an explanation. Those small, needling comments had never escalated to blatant discrimination, but they accumulated into a quiet but persistent sense of otherness. What struck Ebony hardest now was the realization that Charlotte, with her authoritative HOA role, might be the mouthpiece for a broader undercurrent of unspoken prejudice. The veneer of civility in Redwood Lake Estates was generally well maintained. Everyone praised the tree-lined streets and the well-kept yards. But Ebony had read enough accounts and experienced enough coded language in her life to recognize that a politely worded intrusion could still carry harmful intent. That afternoon's exchange replayed in Ebony's mind, Charlotte scanning her yard, clipboard in hand, and remarking on community atmosphere. The subtext seemed to suggest that Ebony's personal habits were incongruent with the neighborhood's expectations. It wasn't a direct accusation, but there was an undercurrent. Perhaps Ebony, an accomplished professional with a property she adored, was perceived by some as an uninvited disruptor. She closed her eyes, taking a slow breath. Maybe Charlotte's remarks were no more than a neighbor's misguided priorities. Maybe Ebony was overthinking it. She wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. After all, Redwood Lake Estates wasn't an explicitly hostile place. If anything, it was the quietness that unnerved her, the veiled suggestion that she was being judged in hushed tones, rather than anyone openly discussing concerns. Unable to shake the tension, Ebony decided to confide in a friend. She picked up her phone and called Fiona Brooks, a close colleague who lived in a nearby city. Fiona, also a person of color, immediately caught on to the situation. "Girl, this sounds like it's more about you than the pool," Fiona said bluntly. "They might not say it to your face, but you can tell when people have a problem with you just for existing where they think you don't belong." Ebony sighed, swirling her iced tea. "That's exactly how it felt. She basically told me not to cover my own pool so early. It's my property." But it was her tone that really got to me, like I owed her an explanation. Fiona's voice softened. "Don't let her rattle you. It's your home. You earned it. If she's got an issue, she can take it up with the HOA rules, which clearly say nothing about pool covers." Ebony nodded, feeling marginally better at the reminder that she wasn't in violation of any regulation. However, she couldn't quite dismiss the unease. "Thanks, Fiona. I appreciate it. I guess I just need to be prepared if something else happens." For the rest of the evening, Ebony tried to focus on her book, a well-worn hardcover she'd been meaning to finish for months. But her mind kept wandering, replaying Charlotte's critical gaze. She could practically hear the unspoken message beneath Charlotte's words: "Conform to our unwritten norms, or you'll stand out." Despite her misgivings, Ebony resolved to give Redwood Lake Estates, and Charlotte, another chance. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding. She remembered her own determination when she bought the house. She wasn't going to let vague disapproval scare her away from living life on her own terms. She had faced down larger hurdles than an overbearing HOA president. Still, she couldn't shake the sense that a boundary had been crossed. The next day, Ebony took extra care to check the official HOA guidelines, verifying once again that her pool setup was fully compliant and that covering it at any time was her prerogative. She wanted no surprises if Charlotte decided to escalate the matter. Yet, as she typed away on her laptop, scanning through the association's bylaws, she felt a persistent knot in her stomach, a premonition that Charlotte's issue with her wasn't merely about a pool cover. By the time she shut down her computer, the sky had darkened, and the quiet hum of cicadas drifted through her open window. She glanced outside at the moonlit surface of her covered pool, feeling a twinge of sadness that this place of refuge had suddenly become a source of conflict. Yes, Redwood Lake Estates remained picturesque, but Ebony wondered how many unseen battles were waged behind those pristine hedges and flower beds. In that moment, she vowed to stay true to herself. Regardless of Charlotte's stance or the subtle undertones of prejudice, Ebony refused to surrender the peaceful life she had worked so hard to create. If it came down to defending her rights and her dignity, she would be ready. A week passed without further confrontation from Charlotte Davenport. Ebony Harris began to relax, reassuring herself that perhaps the tension was just a fluke, an isolated moment of misunderstanding. She carried on with her routine, managing her demanding work schedule, watering the small herb garden lining the fence, and savoring an evening swim whenever she could. The pleasant quiet of Redwood Lake Estates lulled her into thinking that everything had returned to normal. Then, early one Saturday afternoon, while Ebony was reading a book in her living room, she heard a sharp knock on her front door. Setting aside her novel, she rose to answer it and, to her surprise, found two uniformed police officers standing on her porch. The sight of flashing patrol lights reflecting off the windows sent her pulse racing. Concerned but polite, she opened the door. "Officers," she greeted, her voice carefully calm. "Can I help you?" One officer, his name tag reading Martinez, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we received a call about suspicious activity at this address. The caller mentioned something about you covering your pool and not coming back outside." Ebony blinked, incredulous. "Suspicious activity? Because I covered my pool." She felt a wave of déjà vu, recalling Charlotte's earlier complaint about the pool cover. However, she forced herself to remain composed. "I'm not sure how that's suspicious, but I'd be happy to speak with you." Martinez glanced at his partner, Officer Randall, who stood with a notepad in hand. "We're just following up. The caller claimed there might be an issue since you haven't been seen using the pool after putting the cover on. She suggested someone might be hiding in your backyard." Ebony's heart sank. She couldn't imagine who else would lodge such a call, especially with such a flimsy pretext. "Well, I'm here," she said, gesturing inside her home, "and there's no one in the backyard except maybe a few squirrels. Would you like to come in or see the yard? I have nothing to hide." Martinez looked somewhat apologetic. "We do need to check the property to verify everything is fine. May we walk around back?" Ebony nodded, stepping aside so they could make their way through the gate. As they entered the backyard, she couldn't help but feel a pang of violation. Though the officers were polite, the very fact that they were there, responding to a spurious call, put her on edge. Her quiet sanctuary felt suddenly exposed to scrutiny. In the backyard, the officers found exactly what Ebony had said they would: a neatly covered in-ground pool, a handful of potted herbs along the fence, and absolutely no sign of suspicious activity. Officer Randall made a few notes, then turned to Ebony with a quizzical expression. "It's clear nothing is amiss here," he said. "Do you have any idea who might have called?" Ebony exhaled, clenching her hands to steady her nerves. She considered whether to mention Charlotte by name, but decided not to jump to conclusions without proof. "I can't be certain," she replied diplomatically. "But there was a minor disagreement a week ago about me covering the pool. I suppose someone could have misunderstood my actions." Martinez raised an eyebrow. "Well, from what we see, everything's above board. You're obviously not doing anything illegal. I apologize for the inconvenience, but we had to follow up on the call." Before they left, the officers handed Ebony a card with their contact information, advising her to notify them if she experienced any further harassment. After shutting the front door behind them, Ebony leaned against it for a moment, feeling her heart still pounding. As the squad car pulled away from her driveway, she tried to steady herself. Anger mingled with anxiety in her chest. Not only had her private space been disturbed, but now there was a record of a police visit that could feed rumors among neighbors who might already be wary of her. To clear her head, Ebony phoned Fiona Brooks again, relaying the bizarre situation. "They called the police on you for covering your pool?" Fiona repeated, incredulous. "That's insane." Ebony rubbed her temples. "It's not just that. The report they made insinuated something sinister, like I'm hiding someone or something. It's humiliating. The officers were polite, but this whole thing is absurd." Fiona was quiet for a moment. "You need to document this, Ebony," she finally said. "Keep track of every incident, every odd interaction. If this keeps escalating, you'll need evidence to show a pattern." That night, Ebony typed up a detailed account of the events in a digital journal, including exact times, the officers' names, and the nature of the complaint. She also made a mental note to look into whether other homeowners in Redwood Lake Estates had faced similar issues. Although she hadn't had much direct interaction with others, beyond casual waves and small talk, she suspected she wasn't the first or only target of Charlotte's scrutiny. As she tried to settle into bed, Ebony found sleep elusive. She kept replaying the visit, the faint red and blue lights reflecting on her living room walls, and the uncomfortable questions that Officer Martinez and Officer Randall had asked. Despite their courteous manner, the experience left her feeling exposed. A part of her wondered if calling the police might be part of a larger ploy to intimidate her into compliance with some unwritten social code of Redwood Lake Estates. If so, Ebony resolved she would not yield. She was within her rights to cover her pool, enjoy her property, and live without the looming fear of false accusations. A few days after the police visit, Ebony Harris found herself revisiting the unsettling episode in her mind. The idea that Charlotte Davenport had likely orchestrated the call didn't sit well with her, but she struggled to find concrete evidence tying Charlotte to the incident. She went about her usual routine, morning coffee in the backyard, the daily commute to her tech firm, and quiet evenings with a book or a swim, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Late in the week, a notification on her phone jolted her out of her midday reverie, a voicemail from Officer Martinez. "Ms. Harris," his recorded voice began, "we'd appreciate a follow-up conversation if you have time. Please call us back at your earliest convenience." Ebony's stomach tightened as she listened. She dialed the number immediately, heart pounding. Martinez answered with a courteous greeting. "Thanks for getting back to me so quickly," he said. "We've been looking into the call that was made last weekend." It appears the 911 operator noted the caller's name as Charlotte Davenport, listing an address here in Redwood Lake Estates. Ebony exhaled sharply, her suspicions confirmed. "I had a feeling," she replied. "I still don't understand why she would call the police over me covering my pool." "That's what we wanted to clarify," Martinez continued. "Ms. Davenport claimed she saw unusual behavior, and was worried there might be trespassing. But based on our visit and your statement, there was no evidence of wrongdoing." Ebony felt a wave of relief that the officers believed her. "I'm glad that's clear," she said softly. "She must have exaggerated or fabricated the claim." Martinez hesitated. "We also asked her to provide any recordings or photos she claimed to have. She hasn't produced anything so far. Without any proof to support her story, we're treating this as a possible misuse of emergency services." A spark of indignation flashed within Ebony. Charlotte had not only invaded her peace but had also wasted police resources. "Is there any action you can take?" she asked cautiously. "Right now, we're compiling all the information," Martinez explained. "We'll speak to Ms. Davenport again, and if necessary, the department might file a report about filing a false police complaint. In the meantime, please stay vigilant. Let us know if she contacts you or if there are any further issues." Ebony thanked him and ended the call, feeling a mix of apprehension and validation. The police were skeptical of Charlotte's claims and seemed to grasp that Ebony was an unwitting target. That evening, she sat on her back porch, gazing at the dark waters of her covered in-ground pool and mulling over the strangeness of her predicament. On one hand, she was heartened that law enforcement had recognized the baselessness of Charlotte's accusation. On the other, she was wary that this might spur more conflict if Charlotte felt threatened by the scrutiny. The next day, Ebony's schedule was hectic. She worked a half-day at the office before heading to a department luncheon, trying to keep her mind off neighborhood drama. When she returned home mid-afternoon, she found a glossy, trifold pamphlet taped to her front door. An official notice from the Redwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was a summary of new, community standards, proposals, including bullet points about fence heights, holiday decorations, and, notably, guidelines on pool usage and aesthetics. Scanning the pamphlet, Ebony frowned. The suggestions were phrased politely, but she couldn't help noticing a line stating, "Homeowners are encouraged to keep pools uncovered during daylight hours to maintain a unified neighborhood appearance." While not explicitly mandatory, it felt suspiciously targeted. She bristled at the nerve of Charlotte and her HOA committee. It was as though they were searching for a loophole to control how she enjoyed her property. That evening, Ebony called Officer Martinez back, not to file a formal complaint, but to update him on the HOA's new push. "It might be nothing," she admitted, "but I have a feeling Ms. Davenport is behind this. She's basically trying to rewrite the rules to justify her behavior." Martinez seemed sympathetic. "It's good you're documenting everything. If any official rule changes occur that infringe on your rights, you could consult an attorney. But for now, keep track of any direct harassment. We'll see where our investigation leads." Though somewhat reassured by the officer's advice, Ebony still felt uneasy. She confided in Fiona Brooks once more, venting her frustration at the lengths Charlotte seemed willing to go. "I never asked to be singled out," Ebony said tiredly. "Why can't she just leave me alone and let me follow the existing rules? I'm not doing anything against the HOA code." Fiona's response was resolute. "Because people like Charlotte don't want to see others who don't fit their image of a typical resident. You cover your pool or you sit inside your house, and that's enough to set them off." She's policing your every move. That night, Ebony composed an email to a local legal aid organization, inquiring about her rights if the HOA tried to enforce regulations that weren't officially approved. She also mentioned the false police call in her message, hoping a professional might offer advice on whether she had grounds to contest the harassment. Although no immediate response came, the act of writing everything down, putting the entire series of events into coherent words, offered her a measure of comfort. A sense of determination took root. She was done feeling powerless. If Charlotte persisted in her baseless accusations or manipulated rules to corner Ebony, Ebony intended to fight back. As she prepared for bed, Ebony whispered to herself, "I'll protect what's mine." In her mind's eye, she pictured her peaceful backyard, the shimmering surface of her pool, and the sense of serenity she felt when floating on a warm afternoon. No one, not even a powerful HOA president, would rob her of that hard-earned tranquility without a fight. At the crack of dawn the next morning, Ebony Harris sat at her dining table, laptop glowing in the early light. She rubbed the sleep from her eyes and typed a search query for Charlotte Davenport, Redwood Lake Estates, and any mention of disputes or legal troubles. After the revelation from Officer Martinez that Charlotte had filed a questionable police report, Ebony wanted to see if there was a pattern. The results were sparse. Like many homeowners, Charlotte wasn't a public figure, so her digital footprint appeared minimal. Still, Ebony combed through local community boards, scanning for any mention of HOA controversies. Eventually, she found a brief thread on a neighborhood forum that referred to issues with the new HOA president's approach, though no specific details were given. Most replies were vague, with a couple of homeowners complaining about excessive policy enforcement. Ebony bookmarked the thread, deciding to revisit it after more thorough research. Later that day, Fiona Brooks came over, armed with her own laptop and unwavering determination. "Let's see if we can piece something together," she said, setting up shop at Ebony's kitchen counter. Over mugs of strong coffee, the two women scoured local court dockets for any civil disputes involving Charlotte's name. They checked property records, homeowner association meeting minutes, anything that might contain a clue. "Here's something," Fiona said suddenly, pointing to a brief snippet on her screen. A year ago, someone named Davenport filed a complaint against a resident in another development called Pinecrest Meadows, claiming improper yard maintenance. The case was dismissed. "You think that's her?" Ebony leaned over to look. The address and first name didn't match exactly, but the broader context of an HOA-related complaint raised suspicions. Davenport isn't that rare a name, but it's worth noting. Especially if she's the type to make official complaints that don't stick. They kept digging, finding scattered references to a C. Davenport in various online discussions about strict HOA policies. Some residents complained about being cited for trivial matters, a basketball hoop left in a driveway, a porch light bulb too bright, or a fence painted a slightly different color than the approved palette. Ebony couldn't confirm all these were about Charlotte, but the pattern of overreach seemed striking. Eventually, they needed a break. Ebony stood and stretched her arms. "This might be a dead end," she sighed. "She probably hides her tracks well." Fiona shook her head, still scrolling. "Let's not give up yet. Sometimes you have to follow the digital breadcrumbs." She paused, squinting at the screen. "Here. A public records site shows a Charlotte Marie Davenport was cited for misusing resources in an unincorporated neighborhood about 2 counties over." Intrigued, Ebony hovered by Fiona's shoulder. The listing was cryptic, referencing a complaint lodged by local authorities. It hinted at repeated false reports or nuisance calls to law enforcement. The record was dated nearly 3 years ago. Though it never reached a full trial, it appeared Charlotte had agreed to pay a fine to settle the matter. Ebony's eyes widened. Misusing resources? That could be exactly what Officer Martinez suspected, filing false or frivolous complaints. Her pulse quickened at the thought that Charlotte had a documented history of pressing baseless accusations. If so, it lent weight to the idea that Ebony wasn't simply a random target, but the latest in a series of scapegoats Charlotte had singled out for her own reasons. Without jumping to conclusions, Ebony saved screenshots and all relevant links, planning to share them with Martinez. She also noted references to local press coverage that might provide additional details. While she wasn't certain it was the same Charlotte Davenport, the timeline and behavior patterns made Ebony feel there was enough smoke to suggest a fire. Emboldened by these findings, Ebony decided it was time to gather support among her neighbors. The Redwood Lake Estates HOA had monthly meetings, typically in the community clubhouse near the entrance of the neighborhood. She resolved to attend the next one, not just as a passive observer but as someone prepared to confront the president if needed. To test the waters, Ebony went door to door along her street that evening. She started with the home of Rita and Paul Zimmerman, a retired couple known for their friendly smiles and abundant rose garden. They welcomed her warmly, ushering her into the living room. After polite small talk, Ebony broached the subject. "Has Charlotte Davenport ever approached you about any so-called violations?" she asked carefully. The Zimmermans exchanged a glance. Rita answered first, speaking in a hushed tone. "We've had a few notices from the HOA about minor things, like placing a small decorative flag on our porch. It felt nitpicky, and we suspected Charlotte was the one who reported it." Paul nodded in agreement. "We've heard rumors she's singled out other homeowners too. Usually over trivial matters." Ebony's heart sank and soared at once. It was disheartening that Charlotte wielded her authority so freely, but also validating to know she wasn't alone in her predicament. Sensing the Zimmermans' caution, Ebony explained her situation, how the police had been called and how she suspected Charlotte was behind it. The couple reacted with sympathy, sharing that they'd heard about the squad car but hadn't realized Ebony was the target. By the time she left their home, Ebony felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knocked on a few more doors, gathering small anecdotes that painted a clearer picture of Charlotte's pattern of harassment. While not everyone had a story, those who did expressed relief at finally discussing it openly. Armed with this information, Ebony planned to compile it into a concise summary for the police, and possibly the other HOA board members. She believed the best way to counter Charlotte's overreach was to show a consistent pattern of misbehavior. Though Ebony couldn't predict how far Charlotte might go, she resolved to stand firm, buoyed by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. That night, after Fiona headed home, Ebony sat by her laptop under the kitchen's warm overhead light and organized her newfound evidence. She titled the folder, HOA Misconduct, C. Davenport, and felt a semblance of confidence settle over her. She might be one voice, but she was a determined one. With the background check hinting at Charlotte's history and neighbors beginning to speak up, Ebony sensed the tide was slowly shifting in her favor. The tension in Redwood Lake Estates had been quietly simmering for weeks when the situation took a sharp turn no one quite expected. Ebony Harris had spent countless hours compiling documentation, screenshots of suspicious references to Charlotte Davenport's past, notes from neighbors who had felt targeted, and her own detailed accounts of each unsettling event. She was prepared to present her findings at the upcoming HOA meeting, but events would unfold faster than she anticipated. Early one Saturday morning, Ebony was sipping coffee on her front porch when she noticed two police cruisers roll into the neighborhood. She watched as they stopped in front of Charlotte Davenport's house, an imposing two-story with neatly trimmed hedges and an immaculate driveway. The officers exited their vehicles and approached Charlotte's front door. Ebony strained to see what was happening from her vantage point, her heart pounding with curiosity and a trace of apprehension. At first, the scene was quiet. One of the officers knocked, and after a few moments, Charlotte stepped outside. She appeared flustered, glancing nervously around as the officers spoke. Ebony couldn't hear their words, but the exchange didn't look friendly. Within minutes, Charlotte was led away in handcuffs, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. Her posture spoke volumes. From the stiffening of her shoulders to the flash of her eyes, Charlotte clearly couldn't comprehend how her position as HOA president hadn't shielded her from the law. Ebony set her coffee mug down, her hands trembling. She watched the officers guide Charlotte into the back of one cruiser while the other officer retrieved a file from his patrol car. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, peeking from behind curtains or gathering in small clusters on the sidewalk. Whispers and murmurs spread like wildfire. What's going on? Did someone get hurt? Why is the HOA president in handcuffs? Seeking clarity, Ebony decided to walk over to a small group of neighbors gathered across the street. Among them was Rita Zimmerman, who looked just as startled. I heard from a friend who works with the police department that Charlotte's been under investigation for making repeated false reports and abusing her HOA power, Rita whispered, her voice tinged with cautious excitement. Apparently, one of those reports is tied to you, Ebony. Ebony's stomach churned. She never expected the situation to escalate to an arrest, yet a part of her felt an odd sense of relief, validation that her concerns hadn't been paranoia. I knew she made a false report about me covering my pool. But I never thought they'd actually arrest her, she said, her voice trembling slightly. Within minutes, the patrol car carrying Charlotte pulled away from the curb. An eerie hush fell over Redwood Lake Estates as neighbors exchanged glances. Ebony found herself fielding questions from those who suspected she had been directly involved in unveiling Charlotte's misconduct. She explained her experiences, from the unwanted confrontation about her pool cover to the baffling 911 call. The neighbors listened, some nodding in recognition as they recalled their own minor run-ins with Charlotte. Later that day, Ebony received a call from Officer Martinez. He confirmed that Charlotte had been taken into custody following the discovery of multiple instances where she had fabricated complaints or misused emergency services to harass residents. Your documentation helped us see a pattern, he said. Combined with her previous record in another county, it gave us probable cause to act. We've also received a statement from the HOA board that they never authorized her to enforce rules not on the books. Despite the gravity of the situation, Ebony felt a sense of vindication wash over her. Thank you for letting me know, officer, she said. What happens now? She'll face charges for misusing 911 and possibly for harassment, depending on what the investigation turns up. We'll keep you in the loop, Martinez replied. After hanging up, Ebony pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat slowly steady. Word of Charlotte's arrest spread like lightning throughout Redwood Lake Estates. Emails buzzed back and forth, texts were exchanged, and the neighborhood's informal social media group lit up with speculation. Some expressed shock that a seemingly respectable HOA president could behave in such a manner, others admitted they weren't surprised, given her track record of nitpicking and intimidation. In the days that followed, the Redwood Lake Estates HOA board announced an emergency meeting to address Charlotte's abrupt departure and discuss the vacant president's seat. Ebony, while apprehensive about attending, knew she had to be there. She wasn't sure if her presence would be met with support or skepticism, but she wanted to ensure that the truth about Charlotte's actions would be publicly acknowledged. When the meeting date arrived, Ebony walked into the community clubhouse with her shoulders squared, a folder of evidence tucked under her arm. The room buzzed with murmurs and the scraping of chairs. A handful of neighbors offered sympathetic smiles, some even approached to thank her for helping to expose the problems with Charlotte's leadership. At the front of the room, the remaining HOA board members, who had kept mostly silent until now, looked uneasy. They were faced with the daunting task of explaining how their president had been allowed so much unchecked power. Ebony sat quietly, waiting for her moment to speak, determined to ensure that the culture of Redwood Lake Estates would not revert to its old ways once the uproar died down. Charlotte Davenport's arrest was not the end of the story, but it was a turning point. For Ebony, it marked the moment when her quiet struggle for respect and dignity in a seemingly tranquil suburb transitioned into a collective reckoning. The veil had been lifted, Redwood Lake Estates could no longer pretend that prejudice and overreach didn't exist within its pristine boundaries. Now, they would need to decide how to move forward as a community in the aftermath of one person's misuse of authority. Following Charlotte Davenport's arrest, the board of Redwood Lake Estates found itself facing a confluence of outrage, confusion, and urgent demands for transparency. Within days, the interim HOA chair scheduled a special gathering in the community clubhouse, a low-slung building by the neighborhood's entrance that typically hosted holiday parties and craft fairs rather than crisis meetings. Despite the short notice, word traveled quickly, and an uncharacteristically large crowd assembled, filling rows of metal folding chairs. Ebony Harris arrived early, determined to secure a seat in the front row. Clutching a folder containing her meticulously organized notes, screenshots, and printed statements from neighbors, she felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. After all, this was the opportunity for Redwood Lake Estates to confront its problematic leadership publicly. With Charlotte under arrest, the remaining HOA board members were expected to either step up or risk being tarnished by association. At precisely 7 p.m., the interim chair, a soft-spoken man named Douglas Gentry, rapped a gavel against the podium. "I'd like to call this special meeting of the Redwood Lake Estates Homeowners Association to order," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "We are all aware that recent events have cast a spotlight on certain practices within our organization. We intend to address these issues openly and honestly." A hush settled over the attendees. Ebony spotted Rita and Paul Zimmerman in the crowd, alongside a growing number of residents who had quietly endured Charlotte's overreach. The tension was almost palpable, as though everyone were bracing for revelations they already suspected. Douglas inhaled deeply, scanning the room before continuing. "First and foremost, I want to clarify that Charlotte Davenport has been officially removed from her position as HOA president, effective immediately. She is no longer authorized to act on behalf of this organization." A wave of murmured relief swept through the room, punctuated by a smattering of hushed applause. Ebony exhaled, grateful that the most urgent action had been taken. Yet she knew that one person's removal might not be enough to fix deeper issues. Douglas nodded gravely. "As you all are aware, Ms. Davenport was arrested on charges related to filing false police reports and possibly other forms of harassment. We, as your board, have initiated an internal review to ensure that any questionable policies introduced during her tenure are examined and, if necessary, repealed." Now came the moment Ebony had both dreaded and anticipated. She raised her hand, and when Douglas acknowledged her, she stood, clearing her throat. "I have documentation I'd like to share," Ebony said, stepping toward the podium. Her voice projected clearly, fueled by a desire for justice and clarity. "It includes records of repeated harassment by Ms. Davenport, instances of her citing non-existent rules, and statements from neighbors who felt targeted." Douglas beckoned her forward. Ebony laid out copies of her documents, swiftly summarizing the timeline of events: Charlotte's initial confrontation about the pool cover, the 911 call, the officer's skepticism, and the subsequent background check revealing a pattern of false complaints. As Ebony spoke, heads turned, and quiet gasps escaped some in the audience. Many were unaware just how far Charlotte had gone. When Ebony finished, a tense silence gripped the room. Finally, Linda Ramos, a middle-aged board member who oversaw the neighborhood's landscaping committee, spoke up. "Ms. Harris, I'm sorry you had to endure this. I believe all of us owe you an apology if we failed to see what was happening." Others chimed in, some offering sympathy, others acknowledging their own experiences of Charlotte's micromanagement. A neighbor recounted how Charlotte had once threatened fines for a child's bicycle left on the front walkway. Another shared that Charlotte had confronted them over the color of their seasonal wreath, insisting it violated community standards, though no such policy existed. It seemed that Ebony's story had ignited a willingness among residents to publicly air their grievances. Douglas, though clearly rattled by the volume of complaints, maintained his composure. "I propose we form a special committee, made up of board members and residents, dedicated to reviewing all HOA guidelines for clarity and fairness. We will also thoroughly investigate any actions Charlotte took on behalf of the association that may have been unauthorized or unethical." A chorus of agreements echoed through the clubhouse. The wave of relief among those gathered was unmistakable. While some might have feared that removing Charlotte would leave a leadership void, the sentiment now was one of cautious optimism. At least Redwood Lake Estates was addressing the problem rather than sweeping it under the rug. Ebony felt a lump form in her throat as she realized the importance of what was unfolding. Real change was happening, driven by neighbors willing to speak up. She was grateful for the opportunity to contribute and, more importantly, to be heard. It wasn't lost on her that she had faced a unique kind of scrutiny from Charlotte, one likely rooted in prejudice, but tonight, the crowd appeared united in their resolve to dismantle the flawed system that allowed such behavior to thrive. Before the meeting adjourned, Douglas asked Ebony and several other volunteers to join the newly proposed committee. Ebony accepted, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a genuine sense of belonging. As the rows of chairs emptied and the lights dimmed, she lingered in conversation with neighbors who had once been little more than distant faces. They discussed potential reforms, from clarifying bylaws to instituting an anonymous complaint process that would prevent future abuses of power. Walking home under the soft glow of street lamps, Ebony reflected on the sudden turn her life had taken. Only a short time ago, Redwood Lake Estates had felt like hostile territory, a place where she was under constant watch. But now, as she passed the quiet, neatly kept houses, she felt a stir of hope. By bringing the truth to light, she had played a role in dismantling a toxic dynamic that had festered too long. There was no guarantee that life in Redwood Lake Estates would be perfect from here on out, but the community's collective step toward accountability was undeniable. And in that, Ebony found renewed faith in the idea that one voice, backed by the courage to speak up, could indeed spark meaningful change. In the weeks that followed Charlotte Davenport's removal as HOA president, Redwood Lake Estates underwent a quiet but significant transformation. The special committee formed during the emergency meeting got to work immediately, sifting through outdated bylaws and removing ambiguous language that had allowed a single individual to exert undue influence. Residents who had previously felt isolated or intimidated came forward with suggestions to improve the neighborhood's sense of cohesion. One of the first reforms enacted was a clearer set of HOA guidelines, drafted by the committee that included Ebony Harris, Rita Zimmerman, and several others. This revamped document focused on transparency, fairness, and inclusivity, making it more difficult for anyone to wield authority unilaterally. The guidelines also emphasized respectful communication, outlining steps for resolving disputes without resorting to drastic measures like calling the police over minor concerns. Alongside these policy changes, a new spirit of community engagement took hold. The neighbors organized block parties where families shared food, games, and conversation. Ebony's contribution involved hosting a poolside gathering, where she happily invited people to swim or lounge near the water she once felt compelled to keep hidden. Children splashed under the sun, while adults chatted freely, bridging gaps that had existed for too long. In the past, Redwood Lake Estates had been known for its manicured lawns and picturesque houses. Now, it was gaining a reputation for unity and openness. Even the HOA board meetings felt different. Gone was the tense atmosphere of suspicion that once pervaded every discussion. Instead, homeowners shared ideas on landscaping, community events, and improvements to shared amenities. Ebony, for her part, discovered an unexpected role as a neighborhood advocate. Her involvement in uncovering Charlotte's abuses earned her a level of respect she hadn't anticipated. Residents often sought her opinion on HOA-related matters, grateful for her willingness to speak up when something seemed wrong. Although she had never envisioned herself as a community leader, Ebony found fulfillment in helping Redwood Lake Estates evolve into the inclusive haven she had always hoped it would be. While not every issue vanished overnight, no neighborhood was perfect, Ebony noticed that most people were genuinely trying to keep an open mind and foster good neighborly relations. The petty criticisms over pool covers and porch flags gave way to constructive feedback about neighborhood beautification and social events. Everyone began to see that cooperation, rather than intimidation, was key to maintaining a peaceful and pleasant environment. Standing on her back deck one afternoon, Ebony surveyed the sparkle of her in-ground pool in the sunlight. She recalled the turmoil that once surrounded this simple luxury. Now, the pool stood not just as her personal refuge but as a symbol of resilience and cooperation. Against all odds, Redwood Lake Estates was learning to treat every homeowner with dignity. A change that would outlast any single HOA presidency. As the dust settled from the dramatic events that had rocked Redwood Lake Estates, a new chapter began. With Charlotte Davenport removed from power, the community rallied behind a collective vision of accountability and respect. People who had once viewed each other only in passing started engaging in candid conversations about what kind of neighborhood they wished to create. Ebony Harris played a pivotal role in this transformation, though she often felt surprised by her newfound position as an informal spokesperson for fairness. With her soft-spoken demeanor and steady determination, she encouraged residents to speak out whenever they noticed bias or unfair treatment. The reforms enacted by the HOA committee, now led by a more balanced mix of board members, served as a guiding framework for resolving issues before they escalated into major disputes. One outcome of these changes was the establishment of a neighborhood watch with care. Unlike typical neighborhood watches, which focused solely on security, this group emphasized mutual support and open dialogue. Volunteers patrolled the streets not just to deter crime, but also to check on neighbors who might need assistance. The goal was to ensure everyone felt seen and heard, moving beyond the suspicion and divisiveness that once haunted the community. Through these initiatives, neighbors discovered surprising commonalities. The single mother down the street who needed help with childcare found support from a retired couple eager to babysit their grandchild's playmate. A teacher returning from evening classes felt safer knowing her neighbors were looking out for her. Small acts of kindness multiplied, stitching together a neighborhood tapestry that was stronger and more vibrant than before. Ebony's once anxious decision to move to Redwood Lake Estates now felt validated. Standing on her freshly painted deck, overlooking the sparkling in-ground pool where it all began, she felt a surge of pride. She had fought for her right to enjoy her property without fear or prejudice, and in doing so, she had inadvertently ignited a movement of unity. The community she saw taking shape was far from perfect, but it was undeniably on the path to becoming a place where everyone could flourish. Reflecting on the journey, Ebony understood that real change rarely comes without challenges. The arrest of a once influential HOA president might have seemed an extreme measure, but it had exposed a systemic flaw that required collective courage to address. Now, Redwood Lake Estates served as a testament to the power of perseverance and honest communication. Homeowners learned that it was not enough to keep their lawns trimmed and their houses immaculate, they also needed to nurture a culture of inclusivity. In that spirit of renewed hope, Ebony welcomed the future. She resolved to keep advocating for equitable treatment, not just in her own backyard but throughout Redwood Lake Estates. After all, she knew firsthand how a single spark of truth could illuminate an entire community, transforming it into a place everyone was proud to call home. Hey everyone! If you found this story powerful and meaningful, please show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to the channel, ringing the bell to never miss our thought-provoking content. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire, educate, and challenge perspectives. Thank you for being part of this journey.